In this episode, we focus on one of the highest stakes areas of AI risk, using models to support or influence decisions about people's lives. When AI helps decide who gets a loan, who gets hired, what healthcare priority someone receives, or what safety action should be taken, the consequences can be personal, immediate, and difficult to undo. Beginners sometimes assume the main issue is whether the model is accurate, but decisioning risk is broader than accuracy. It includes fairness, transparency, privacy, accountability, and how humans interpret and rely on model outputs. It also includes the simple truth that people are not data points, and a decision that looks reasonable statistically can still be harmful or unacceptable in real life. By the end, you should understand why decisioning is special, what kinds of harms show up in credit, hiring, healthcare, and safety contexts, and what controls reduce risk without becoming overly technical. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To ground this, it helps to define decisioning in plain language. Decisioning is the process where an organization chooses an outcome that affects a person or a situation, such as approval or denial, ranking or selection, diagnosis or treatment priority, or a safety intervention. AI can be used in decisioning in different roles, and the role matters. Sometimes the model is advisory, meaning it suggests an option, but a human decides. Sometimes it is prioritizing, meaning it ranks cases so some are handled sooner than others. Sometimes it is automated, meaning the model output directly triggers a decision without a human review. Sometimes it is blended, meaning a human can override, but usually follows the model's recommendation. Risk increases as the model's influence increases and as the decision becomes harder to challenge or reverse. Understanding the model's role is the first control because you cannot govern what you have not clearly defined. Decisioning deserves special care because the harms are often unevenly distributed and can affect protected interests like equal opportunity, access to essential services, and physical safety. In credit, a model might deny a person a loan, raise interest rates, or limit access to housing opportunities. In hiring, a model might screen out qualified candidates, amplify bias, or create a workplace that lacks diversity and fairness. In healthcare, a model might misprioritize patients, miss warning signs, or recommend actions that conflict with clinical judgment. In safety cases, a model might trigger unnecessary interventions or fail to trigger needed ones, putting people at risk. These harms can be hard to detect because an individual only sees their own outcome, not the full pattern across a population. This is why controls must include both individual safeguards and population-level monitoring for unfair patterns. A key beginner concept here is that decisioning models can be wrong in at least two different ways. They can be inaccurate, and they can be unfair, and those are not identical problems. A model could be accurate on average, but systematically less accurate for certain groups because of differences in data representation. A model could produce outcomes that are consistent with past data but reflect past discrimination, essentially repeating history rather than improving it. A model could also use features that seem neutral but act as proxies for sensitive attributes, which can lead to unfair results even if sensitive attributes are not explicitly included. This is why decisioning governance often includes careful feature review, fairness evaluation, and ongoing monitoring rather than a one-time accuracy test. For beginners, the simple lesson is that being correct often is not enough when the cost of being wrong is high and the wrongness is not evenly shared. Another reason decisioning is risky is that people tend to overtrust model outputs, especially when outputs are presented with confident language or numbers. A human reviewer might assume the model saw something they did not, or might feel pressure to agree with the system because it appears objective. This is a classic automation bias problem, where people rely too heavily on automated suggestions. The opposite problem can also happen, where people distrust the model completely and ignore useful warnings, but in high-pressure environments over-reliance is often more common. Controls therefore need to address how outputs are presented and how humans are trained to use them. For example, if the model output is a score or ranking, Humans need to understand what it represents and what it does not represent. They also need clear guidance about when to override and how to document the reason for doing so. Now let's look at credit decisioning, which is a common high-stakes environment because it affects access to money and opportunity. Credit models can be used to approve or deny, set pricing, and detect fraud, and each use has different risks. The biggest risk themes include fairness, explainability, and compliance with rules that require reasons for adverse decisions. Even without knowing specific laws, you can see why explanation matters. If someone is denied credit, they need to understand why, and the organization needs to show that the decision was based on legitimate factors. Another risk is that data used in credit can be sensitive, and using alternative data sources can introduce privacy concerns and bias. Controls in credit often focus on clear data governance, model validation for fairness and stability, and processes that allow for appeals or human review when outcomes seem questionable. The goal is to ensure decisions are consistent, justifiable, and challengeable when necessary. Hiring decisioning is similarly sensitive because it affects people's livelihoods and because bias can be subtle. Models might be used to screen resumes, rank candidates, analyze interviews, or predict performance, and each step can introduce risk. A major issue in hiring is that historical data can reflect past hiring preferences that were unfair or that favored certain backgrounds. If a model learns those patterns, it can reproduce them, filtering out candidates who do not match the past even if they are capable. Another issue is that some signals used in hiring can be socially correlated with protected characteristics, like certain schools, zip codes, or gaps in employment history, which can produce unfair outcomes. Controls in hiring often emphasize limiting the model's role to assistive functions, requiring human accountability, validating that selection rates do not show harmful patterns, and ensuring candidates have a fair process. The organization also needs strong transparency about how AI is used so candidates are not misled. Healthcare decisioning is high stakes because it touches health outcomes, and because clinical decisions often involve uncertainty even without AI. Models might assist with diagnosis, risk scoring, treatment recommendations, or prioritizing patient outreach. The risks include incorrect recommendations, biased performance across different demographic groups, and over-reliance by clinicians who assume the model is more authoritative than it is. Another risk is that healthcare data is extremely sensitive, and misuse or leakage can cause deep harm. Controls in healthcare often stress that AI is decision support, not a replacement for clinical judgment, and that validation must be done with attention to the populations served. Monitoring is critical because patient populations and treatment practices change over time, and a model that once performed well can degrade. Clear escalation paths are also important, so clinicians know what to do when model output conflicts with their observations. Safety decisioning includes many settings, such as workplace safety, transportation, physical security, and public safety-related monitoring. In these contexts, the cost of missing a true risk can be severe, but the cost of false alarms can also be severe because unnecessary interventions can harm people and erode trust. Safety models may trigger alerts, recommend actions, or prioritize inspections, and each of these can create risk if not governed well. A key theme is proportionality, meaning the model's influence should match its reliability and the seriousness of the action it can trigger. Another theme is human-centered response, meaning that humans should have clear guidance on how to interpret and validate model signals before taking irreversible actions. Safety cases also require careful record-keeping, because when harm occurs, questions about accountability and reasonableness become intense. Controls therefore focus on conservative deployment, strong monitoring, and clear boundaries on what the model can and cannot trigger. Across all these domains, a central control is to define the decision boundary, which is the line between what the model can influence and what requires human judgment. A model might be allowed to prioritize cases for review, but not to make final approvals. It might be allowed to flag anomalies, but not to take punitive action automatically. It might be allowed to suggest options, but not to force a choice. This boundary can be adjusted based on risk and maturity, but it must be explicit. Without an explicit boundary, teams drift toward greater automation over time because it feels efficient, and then risk increases quietly. Defining boundaries also helps with accountability, because it clarifies who is responsible for the final decision and where the model fits into that chain. Beginners should remember that boundaries are not anti-technology. They are safety rails that enable responsible use. Another important control is making decisions explainable enough for the people affected and for internal oversight. Explainability does not always mean revealing the math of the model. It means providing understandable reasons for outcomes and being able to trace how data and processes contributed. In decisioning, explanation supports appeals, audits, and fairness monitoring. If a person is denied something important, the organization should be able to explain the key factors that led to that outcome and how the process was governed. Internally, explainability supports debugging when patterns look unfair or when outcomes drift. Controls here include documentation of intended use, documentation of key features and data sources, and procedures for reviewing decisions and outcomes. When explanation is impossible, the organization should treat that as a risk that limits where the model can be used. Ongoing monitoring is also essential because decisioning risk is not static. You need to watch for drift in model performance, changes in population characteristics, and changes in how humans use the model. Monitoring should include both technical signals, like shifts in error rates, and outcome signals, like changes in approval rates across groups or increases in complaints and appeals. It should also include checks on control effectiveness, like whether required human reviews are actually happening and whether overrides are documented. Monitoring is especially important in decisioning because small shifts can have large cumulative impacts across many decisions. Over time, monitoring helps you catch emerging harm early and adjust boundaries, retrain models, or apply additional controls. Without monitoring, a model can quietly become unsafe while still appearing stable on paper. As we close, controlling model use in decisioning is about respecting the stakes and building governance that matches the potential harm. You start by defining the model's role and decision boundaries so automation does not creep into areas where it should not be trusted. You recognize that risk includes fairness, explainability, privacy, and human behavior, not just accuracy. You apply domain-aware thinking because credit, hiring, healthcare, and safety each have unique consequences and expectations, but they share the need for accountability and oversight. You design controls that shape how humans rely on outputs, provide understandable reasons for decisions, and support appeals and audits when outcomes are challenged. Finally, you commit to ongoing monitoring and improvement because real-world conditions change and decisioning systems must remain safe over time. When you approach decisioning this way, you protect individuals, you protect the organization, and you build AI systems that support better decisions rather than creating new harms.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.